Ryszard Kuklinski, codenamed Jack Strong, a Polish and American hero, helped the United States defeat Soviet Russia. In Moscow, he obtained top-secret plans for Red Army aggression in Europe. He prevented the outbreak of the Third World War, in which Poland was to have become a nuclear wasteland, and Polish soldiers cannon fodder for the Russian marshals. Sentenced to death by the communists, he was exonerated by Free Poland. His life and activities in the year 1971 to 1981 represent the most important intelligence mission of the Cold War. Measured by political and military consequences, he was the most important US intelligence agent of the 20th century. Colonel Kuklinski, posthumously promoted to general, risked his life and the lives of his family by making difficult decisions. He was possessed not only of military courage, but also ordinary civil courage too. In Moscow, he gained possession of strategic plans for Soviet aggression towards Western Europe and NATO states, which he then handed to the Americans. These were in fact the plans for the unleashing of a Third World War by the evil communist empire. By providing these plans to the Americans, General Kuklinski helped the United States to win the Cold War. This has been confirmed not only by the political, military and intelligence authorities of the United States, but also by Soviet marshals and generals. For the Poles, a Third World War would have been a catastrophe, regardless of its outcome. General Kuklinski, head of the Strategic Defense Planning Department of the General Staff of the Polish Army, was also the secretary of the Polish delegation to meetings of the Warsaw Pact, as well as the liaison officer between Red Army Command and the Polish People's Army. Ryszard Kuklinski said, "The efforts of the United States meant that the world avoided a nuclear holocaust, which Moscow included in its strategic plans. The knowledge of what would happen should war begin was overwhelming. For years I had been sticking little mushroom symbols on the huge staff maps signifying nuclear explosions. Blue for the bombs to come from the west, red where ours were supposed to land." There is no doubt that Kuklinski broke his military oath of obedience to the Red Army and the Warsaw Pact. He was spurred to this course of action by the events of December 1970, when unarmed civilians were killed by regular Polish army units, representing Soviet and communist domination. This followed Warsaw Pact aggression in Czechoslovakia in 1968 and the presence of Soviet nuclear weapons on Polish territory. In 1986, President Reagan met with Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev in Reykjavik, Iceland, presenting to the world the beginning of a new period of warmer relations between the USA and the Soviet Union. Yet from the outset, Gorbachev was not in the mood to make concessions. A certain little-known incident changed his mind. At one point in the negotiations, the US Defense Secretary, famous Pentagon Chief Caspar Weinberger, handed some documents to President Reagan. The president passed the documents to Gorbachev, who in turn handed them to the Chief of the General Staff of the Soviet Armed Forces, Sergei Akhromeyev, who glanced at the papers and went pale. In his hands he was holding detailed plans and blueprints for the most important Soviet bunkers to be used in the event of a nuclear war, World War III. The Americans had been targeting these locations for years. Marshal Akhromeyev explained the significance of these documents to Gorbachev, who, although a civilian, understood at once. This was an unmitigated disaster for the Soviets, and so began the US-Soviet negotiations. From that moment, the Russians were in retreat. The fall of communism in the late 80s in Central and Eastern Europe. At the beginning of the 1980s, communism was still at the height of its powers, although there were clear signs of the imminent collapse. Communist life was dominated by Leonid Brezhnev, a member of the group of elderly men in power, known as the gerontocracy. It was clear that something had to change, and so it did, but very slowly. After the death of Brezhnev, other politicians, mainly connected to the security services, tried to take control of the Soviet Union. These were brief episodes in comparison to the long rule of the last leader, Mikhail Gorbachev. Communism was still looking for opportunities to develop and to make its presence felt wherever possible. The USSR tried to participate in every conflict, and in every conflict, it supported forces opposed to the Western powers. The apparent thaw in relations took place against a constant backdrop of conflicts. In 1975, negotiations began at the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, aimed at ending the diplomatic conflict that had been ongoing since the end of the Second World War. These were the Helsinki talks. After very difficult negotiations regarding the 4 baskets of cooperation, security, education, economy, and humanitarian missions, the 4th basket was the most important, since it related to human rights. These human rights became a motivational element for those who were opposed to communism. They received an additional boost in the form of a determination whether a country that signed the Helsinki Agreement complied with these obligations. This was a mobilizing force for various movements that began to organize within particular countries. Among these structures, the Poles were undoubtedly seen as the opposition. At the same time, in this global confrontation, a new factor appeared. This was the clear shift in American policy with the election of Ronald Reagan. He was a president who undertook a clear path of confrontation. And it was a period when, as the Soviets knew full well, they had reached the apogee of their capabilities. The 1980s really were a period when the plans to attack Europe and engage in conflict with the Western world were entirely feasible, except there was no decision-making center. The gerontocracy was not prepared to face these challenges. At the same time, it must be said that the degree to which the Americans had analyzed the Soviet forces was immense. The Americans had information about the precise location of Soviet command centers. And the capacity to eliminate them within minutes of the beginning of any potential conflict. They demonstrated this when Gorbachev was in power in the Kremlin. They demonstrated what they were capable of, and Gorbachev passed these plans on to the marshals accompanying him, who simply turned white because they realized that their last arguments had been knocked out of their hands. It was the moment when the Russians realized they had no trumps to play in the confrontation with the West. This undoubtedly triggered the very clear dismantling of the Soviet Empire. The loss of military dominance was simultaneously combined with an economic crisis. Whereas in Western countries, Military innovation fueled the area of civilian economy. In the East, the situation was entirely different.
Gospodarka wojskowa, wojenna czy militarna związana była.
The military economy was completely separated from the civilian economy. So the overall economy did not benefit from the army's technological development. This was the main cause of the collapse, as well as an excessive dependence on borrowing, or more properly intellectual and technological theft. The entire Soviet system grew from these borrowings. It was the illegal adoption of innovative technical patents.
Innowacji technicznych, które dostosowywano. Oczywiście to jest także okres, kiedy
Obviously, it was a period when licenses were bought, but weak ones for items that were only novel in the Soviet sphere of influence.
Zdominowanym przez Sowiety, tym niemniej jednak tu właściwie
A clear economic regression was observable, above all in agriculture,
także brak efektów, które każą coraz bardziej,
which increasingly reached out to the West for assistance which had to be paid for.
To wymaga także przede wszystkim eksploatacji.
The money was found from the exploitation of raw materials.
Podstawowym bogactwem, ale to jest przede wszystkim
The unprocessed product, which is the basis of wealth, would not save the economy.
Ale to już jest naprawdę swoisty paroksyzm, bo ewidentny
The crisis hit in almost all areas of economic and social life.
Życia gospodarczego, ale także i społecznego. Poza tym rodząca się
The emerging opposition in various communities meant that many issues that had previously been hidden by propaganda suddenly became an element of political discussion, albeit unofficially. The mood of society determined that the nations of the Soviet system were sinking deeper into crisis. 1985 was noteworthy.
Jest dosyć interesujący ze względu na to, że system
in that the Soviet system experienced a certain revival when the position of Gensec, the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, was taken by Mikhail Gorbachev. This was a man who had no ties to the traditional group of revolutionaries. Rather a technocrat who tried to rationalize an economy to date based on an ideology. It seemed as if his plans to restrict the nomenclatura and to limit certain extremely ideologized elements of the economy might meet with success. He encouraged a whole raft of young people to engage in rebuilding the system. This was perestroika and glasnost, two separate strands, one related to the economy and the other to the transparency of public life, which up to this point had simply been concealed by propaganda. Of course, this did not mean that propaganda disappeared completely, but certain elements of this new openness did appear. Paradoxically, the liberalizing activities permitted a critical attitude to the decisions of the authorities. It was finally possible to publicly criticize the authorities throughout the communist bloc. Reactions were mixed. In the German Democratic Republic, for instance, the policy of glasnost and perestroika was considered to be a tragedy for East German society. The sale of certain Russian newspapers was even banned. To prevent the spread of these new tendencies entering the GDR from the East. At the same time, this was an important time since it revitalized countries that had previously been dominated by Moscow. It helped develop what was known as Euro-communism. This was a model that allowed Western societies sympathetic to communism
tym, którzy są dosyć daleko od komunizmu, ale jednocześnie chcą zachować pewien
to maintain contact with the ongoing events in the Eastern Bloc and to find, in the stream of economic and social activities, communism. On the other hand, there arose a different concept, that of Finlandization. Today we know that the long-serving president of Finland, Urho Kekkonen, was an agent of Moscow, but it appeared that he was following a policy of friendship with Moscow from a distance. In many countries, it was considered a model to emulate. On one hand, Euro-communism, on the other, Finlandization. Between these two, there were attempts to find a place for those that were not integrally linked to the Communist Party. However, this new NEP new economic policy, as some called Gorbachev, turned out to be very difficult to control. Expectations were far greater than the capability for concessions from the side of party authorities. For some party activists, Gorbachev's concessions often went too far. There was a struggle within the Soviet Union as to which faction, the liberals or those connected to the Hawks, would win. This time, the increasingly awake and self-organizing society began to pressure the authorities for further concessions. For many communist parties dominated by Moscow, the end of the 1980s brought tragic news. Moscow was folding up its umbrella of protection over them. This meant that they would have to deal with their own societies, their own opposition by themselves. Every man for himself. For neighboring countries, a new period of compromise began to handle the altered circumstances. The communists contended that, since there would be no more fraternal assistance, since the umbrella had been folded up, other solutions would have to be found. The leaders of some countries were often connected with the old concrete systems. They were Brezhnev's people, or from still earlier periods. Often they pretended to adapt to the new situation. At the end of the 1980s, changes began to take place within the Soviet Union itself. Mikhail Gorbachev entered into a conflict with Yegor Ligyachev, his greatest opponent in the Communist Party. Gorbachev won the conflict, although the criticisms did not die down. In 1988, Gorbachev realized that the end of the current model was approaching relentlessly. He tried to make the Soviet Union resemble a Western state. In 1990, the office of president was introduced. At the same time, the Soviet Union suffered a great blow because it had to withdraw from Afghanistan, which was above all a military defeat, but also a political one. The Americans, who had been supporting the Mujahideen, emerged victorious. Of course, they paid a price for this, but not until later. Moscow, however, suffered a double defeat. In August 1991, there was an attempt to overthrow Gorbachev's government, known as the August Putsch, led by Gennady Yanayev and supported by the army and militia forces. The putsch was remarkably incompetent, one could say infantile. The main role was played by Boris Yeltsin, who proved a tremendous exponent of what Gorbachev had planned. Whilst at the same time remaining a critic of his. Towards the end of Gorbachev's reign, Yeltsin wanted far more radical reforms than Gorbachev. Ultimately, Gorbachev disgraced the Soviet Union. And he used the Polish argument to do it, the Katyn affair. He uncovered the Katyn documents and revealed the fact that Moscow stood behind the Katyn genocide. Stalin and his cronies were responsible. This was the argument for the official dissolution of the Soviet Union. Obviously, the situation was more complicated, since various nations rebelled and announced their independence. It began in Vilna, where conflicts flared up between Russians and Lithuanians. Other republics also declared separatism, their independence. In the autumn of 1991, the Commonwealth of Independent States was formed as an attempt at a federal state in order to salvage the Soviet Union. It turned out to be an unsuccessful attempt, and this political model also collapsed. So ended the communist state in the Soviet Union. Russia returned to her pre-revolutionary traditions and tried to rebuild relations with others. Of course, she wished to retain the greatest possible influence in her former satellites. Attempting to reach agreements with opposition groups that were ready for discussions. For the communist legacy remained large in those countries. In some places, the communists achieved only a small percentage of power. Whereas in others, they were the dominant force.
mają powyżej 60%.
sometimes even 60%.
I wtedy oni decydują także o tym, jaka będzie przyszłość. To wywołuje często
This frequently caused various polarizations and conflicts.
Ogólnie jednak
In general, the dramatic moments were experienced by Romania, which removed its former elites quite violently. Despite this, Romania struggled for a very long time to emerge as an independent state, where the communists were removed from power. In other countries, things went rather more smoothly. Yet somehow the Polish Round Table became the model for several countries, where the communist authorities undertook negotiations with the opposition regarding the future. Poland is perhaps the most vivid example, but similar models were used in a few other countries. Poland began it, becoming a characteristic model, where a section of the so-called democratic opposition was selected by the communist authorities to participate in negotiations. This was a paradox because, as in the example of Poland, it can be seen how the communist authorities selected oppositionists they deemed acceptable, whilst excluding the entire independence opposition and any others they considered inconvenient. The consequences are that, for 25 years, we have been unable to discard the relics of our communist past. There was no return to the pre-occupation country in the legal sense, with the political construction of a free country. There continues, however, to be a connection with the People's Republic as dependent state. The consequences of this connection are easily observable in today's Poland. An example, actually a very clear example, is the entrance to the Powązki Cemetery in Warsaw, where during the interwar period stood the graves of those who had defended Warsaw from the Bolsheviks in 1920. The communists moved the bodies and buried them by the cemetery wall. Today, at the threshold of the cemetery is the tomb of a soldier who served the cause of a free Poland in a very direct way. Colonel, posthumously promoted to general, Ryszard Kuklinski, was a man who tied himself to the West to save the West from the planned aggression of the Soviets. He transferred a series of important documents, and today, as the first Polish officer of NATO, he lies in the place of the Warsaw Eaglets, a symbol of the fight for independence. The stance of Ryszard Kuklinski helped to weaken the Soviet Union. The military information that Kuklinski passed to American intelligence showed the danger of Soviet aggression in the West on the one hand, whereas on the other, it motivated the United States to build its defensive and economic potential, which served to weaken the USSR in the second half of the 80s and led ultimately to the final collapse of the communist bloc.